The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle. On the night of February 29, 1994, a 29-year-old man named Ulrich Tolle lay in his London bedroom in a state of absolute despair. This was not the ordinary despair of a difficult week or a bad month. This was the accumulation of decades of anxiety and chronic depression, an interior darkness so complete that, as he would later describe it, he could not bear to live with himself one more moment. He was, by that point, close to the edge. And then, in the space of a single night, something happened that he has spent the last 30 years trying to describe. He woke in the early hours of the morning, his mind cycling through its familiar spiral of suffering, when a thought broke through with unusual force. He thought, "I cannot live with myself any longer." And then, almost immediately, another thought arose. Wait, who is the I that cannot live with myself? If I cannot live with myself, there must be two of me, the I and the myself it finds intolerable. Which one is real?
He stopped.
The thought stopped. And in the stopping, in the sudden, complete, absolutely unexpected silence of a mind that had been running without pause for 29 years, something opened. He felt himself pulled into what he could only describe as an inner vortex. He lost consciousness in the ordinary sense and woke, hours later, to a world that was the same world and was somehow completely different. The birds were singing. The morning light was falling through the window. Everything was as it had always been, and he was, for the first time in his life, simply present for it. He sat on a park bench for the next 2 years. Not from laziness, not from mental illness, though the experience that precipitated his change had not been far from a breakdown. He sat on the bench because the world had become, in a way he could not explain and could not yet articulate, sufficient. The compulsive thinking, the chronic sense that something was wrong, the background anxiety that had been the texture of his consciousness for as long as he could remember, all of it was gone. Not suppressed. Not managed.
Gone.
And in its absence was something that required no name, no activity, no acquisition to justify itself. It was simply presence. Simply being. And it was he found everything. The book that eventually emerged from this experience, originally self-published in 1997, then picked up by New World Library in 1999, then catapulted into cultural phenomenon when Oprah Winfrey called it one of the most important books she had ever read, is The Power of Now. It has sold more than 16 million copies. It has been translated into more than 30 languages. It has influenced therapists, teachers, businesspeople, athletes, and ordinary people in crisis who found in its pages something that reached a place where other books had not. And it has generated a volume of fierce, sometimes contemptuous criticism from philosophers, psychologists, scientists, and skeptics who find its claims unfalsifiable, its metaphysics confused, and its self-reinforcing structure immune to rational challenge. All of this is true simultaneously. And understanding it, the genuine and the problematic, the real insight and the real danger is what the summary is for. Part 1. The book's architecture and the question that starts it all. The Power of Now is structured as a dialogue, a question-and-answer format in which an unnamed seeker poses the questions that Tolle assumes the reader is already carrying. And Tolle responds. This format is deliberate and significant. It positions Tolle as teacher and the reader as student, which is either a useful pedagogical structure or a quietly authoritarian one depending on how you engage with it, and we will return to this point in the critique. The book's organizing question is stated in the very first chapter and echoes across everything that follows. If our psychological suffering is not caused by our external circumstances, if the same external situation can produce completely different levels of suffering in different people, as is demonstrably the case, then what is actually generating the suffering? And Tolle's answer, stated immediately and developed in every direction across 200 pages, is this: the mind. Specifically, compulsive, involuntary, self-reinforcing identification with the content of the mind, with thoughts, memories, future projections, and above all with the story of me that the mind continuously constructs and continuously defends. He is not saying that thoughts are bad. He is not saying that thinking is the enemy. He is making a precise and important distinction that the entire book rests on. There is a difference between using the mind as a tool, deliberately engaging thought when it is useful, and setting it aside when it is not, and being used by the mind, being the involuntary passenger of a thought process that never stops, that narrates and evaluates and catastrophizes and ruminate without your consciously choosing it. The first relationship with the mind is healthy and useful. The second, Tolle argues, is the source of virtually all psychological suffering. He makes this claim with a directness that leaves no room for equivocation. You are not your mind. The voice in your head, the narrator, the commentator, the inner critic, the planner, the worrier, the one who keeps rehearsing the argument you had last week and rehearsing the conversation you might have next week, that voice is not you. It is something you have, something you contain, something you can observe. And the moment you can observe it, the moment you become the watcher of the thought rather than the thought itself, you have taken the first step toward what Tolle calls presence, which is the book's destination and its deepest claim. Part 2. You are not your mind. Watching the thinker. The first and most important practical teaching in the book is what Tolle calls watching the thinker. It is simple enough to describe. It is quietly revolutionary in its experience when it works. He asks you to notice the voice in your head, not to judge it, not to engage with it, not to try to stop it. Simply to notice it, to become aware that there is a voice and that you are the awareness noticing the voice. This sounds abstract until you try it, at which point it becomes very concrete and in many cases immediately strange. Who exactly is noticing? If I am listening to the voice in my head, and I am aware that I am listening to a voice in my head, then there are, right now, in this moment, two things present: the voice and the awareness of the voice. And the awareness is not the voice. The awareness is something quieter, something more spacious, something that is simply present without commentary. Tolle calls this awareness pure consciousness, or presence, or being. He uses several terms interchangeably, drawing from Buddhist, Hindu, Christian mystical, and various other spiritual traditions, all of which he argues are pointing toward the same experience, with different cultural language. The awareness that notices the thought without being the thought is your true nature, in his view. It is not a thing you possess. It is what you most fundamentally are underneath and prior to all the content that the mind keeps generating. He offers a practical entry point that many readers have found genuinely useful. Ask yourself, right now, what thought is going to arise next? And then wait. Don't try to think of one. Just wait and watch for whatever arises. What happens, typically, is a brief gap. A moment of quiet alertness in which there is awareness, but no particular thought content. And that gap, however brief, however quickly followed by the next thought, is the thing Tolle is pointing toward. It is the glimpse of what he calls the now, the direct experience of presence that is always already here, beneath the surface of the mind's continuous activity. This teaching maps closely onto well-established contemplative practices across multiple traditions: mindfulness meditation in Buddhism, the practice of witness consciousness in Advaita Vedanta, the Quaker concept of the inner light, the Christian mystical tradition of what Meister Eckhart called the ground of the soul. Tolle himself acknowledges these connections. His contribution is not to have invented anything new, but to have found a language and a structure that makes these ancient insights accessible to a Western secular audience that would not encounter them through traditional religious or meditative contexts. Part 3. Consciousness. The way out of pain. The second chapter of the book moves from the identification of the problem, compulsive mind identification, to the specific mechanism through which that identification produces suffering. And here Tolle introduces one of his most important and most contested concepts: the pain body. The ego, the false, mind-made self that thinks it is who you are, is, Tolle argues, characterized by one thing above all others: a sense of threat. Because the ego is a constructed identity rather than a genuine one, it is inherently unstable, inherently vulnerable, inherently afraid. It senses, at some level, the fragility of its own existence, the fact that it is made of thought content rather than genuine being, and it responds to this fragility with a continuous alertness to threat. Not physical threat necessarily. The threats the ego monitors most obsessively are threats to its image, its status, its story, its sense of being right, its claim to superiority or victimhood or whatever particular narrative it has organized itself around. And this continuous threat monitoring produces continuous emotional activation that, over time, accumulates in the body. Tolle calls this accumulated emotional residue the pain body. It is not, he says, a metaphor. It is a real phenomenon, an energy field of contracted, unresolved emotional material that lives in the body and that, when activated, generates emotional experience that seems disproportionate to the present stimulus. The person who reacts to a mild criticism with the emotional intensity of someone facing existential threat is not irrational. They are responding to the pain body that has been activated by a stimulus that resembles the original wounding, the original experience of rejection or inadequacy or abandonment that produced the emotional residue in the first place. The pain body, Tolle says, has two states, dormant and active. When dormant, it is simply there, a heaviness, a flatness, a low-level sense of not quite okay that many people experience as the baseline of their consciousness and mistake for their personality. When activated, by a specific trigger, by accumulated fatigue, by substances, by intense interaction with another person's pain body, it takes over. It generates its own thoughts, thoughts that are specifically calibrated to produce more pain, more conflict, more reactivity. It feeds, Tolle says explicitly, on pain. Pain is what sustains it. Which is why the person in the grip of an activated pain body will, without being aware of it, behave in ways that produce exactly the pain that keeps it alive. The solution Tolle offers is not to fight the pain body, because fighting it is just more engagement, more energy feeding the system. The solution is to observe it. To bring the same quality of conscious, non-judgmental presence to the pain body that you bring to watching a thought, to feel it in the body without being identified with it, to acknowledge its presence without being consumed by it. And when genuine, stable presence is brought to the pain body, he argues, it cannot sustain itself. Consciousness, in Tolle's framework, is to the pain body what light is to darkness. Not a force that attacks darkness. Simply a presence in which darkness cannot exist. Part 4. Time, the present moment, and the only moment that exists. This is the philosophical heart of the book. And it requires careful attention because it is both the most powerful idea Tolle is articulating and the most philosophically slippery. His claim is this: the past does not exist. The future does not exist. The present moment, this specific, immediate, irreducible instant of experience, is the only thing that is real. It is the only thing that ever has been real. Everything that has ever happened, every experience ever had, every thought ever thought, happened in what was at the moment of its occurrence, a present moment. The past is memory occurring now. The future is anticipation occurring now. Now is not a moment in a sequence. Now is the only dimension in which existence actually takes place. This sounds, on first encounter, like a philosophical abstraction or a linguistic trick. Tolle insists it is neither. He insists it is a direct description of the actual structure of experience, something that can be verified not through argument, but through direct observation of your own consciousness at this instant. What do you have direct access to right now? Not the past, which exists only as mental content in the present. Not the future, which exists only as mental content in the present. Only this. Only now. He distinguishes between what he calls clock time and psychological time. Clock time is the practical tool of the mind that allows you to make appointments, learn from the past, and plan for the future. This is legitimate and necessary. Tolle has no quarrel with clock time. What he calls psychological time is something different. The mind's habit of living almost entirely in a mental construction of the past or the future, treating the present moment as merely an obstacle between the unsatisfying past and the hoped-for future, or as a corridor between where you are and where you want to be. Psychological time is the mind's consistent refusal to be here, the compulsive escape into memory or anticipation that produces the quality of not being present for your own life, of always being somewhere else even when you are standing in your living room. The suffering that arises from psychological time is a specific kind of suffering. It is not the pain of direct, immediate experience, which is real and unavoidable and which Tolle never dismisses. It is the additional suffering that the mind generates by refusing to be with what is, the anxiety about what happened yesterday and what might happen tomorrow, the resentment about what was said last month, the dread about what is coming next year. All of this is mind-generated suffering, and all of it arises from the mind's inability or refusal to be fully in the only moment where actual experience occurs. Tolle's prescription is the simplest imaginable and the most difficult to actually do. Be here. Not as a technique, not as a performance of mindfulness, as a genuine, complete, full inhabitation of this present moment, with all of its sensation, all of its immediacy, all of its impermanence. The traffic noise outside your window right now, the feeling of your feet on the floor, the breath moving in and out of your body, the sound of your own heartbeat if you listen for it.
This.
Here.
Now.
Part 5. Mind Strategies for Avoiding the Now. Chapter 4 is one of the most psychologically precise in the book, the part that earns its place not through metaphysical claims, but through recognizable description of how the ordinary human mind actually operates. Tolle identifies several specific strategies by which the mind evades presence. The first and most fundamental is what he calls ordinary unconsciousness, the background static of mild dissatisfaction, vague unease, and low-level resistance to the present moment that most people experience as the default texture of their consciousness. Not dramatic suffering, not crisis, just the persistent sense that something is slightly wrong, that things are not quite right, that if certain conditions were different everything would be better. This low-level resistance is rarely identified as suffering because it is so constant that it has become invisible, simply what consciousness feels like, as far as the person inside it can tell. He also describes what he calls deep unconsciousness, the state that arises when external circumstances become genuinely challenging and the ego's defense mechanisms escalate into crisis mode. This is the state of acute anxiety, of severe depression, of the explosive rage that seems to arrive from nowhere and that the person in the middle of it often cannot explain afterward. Deep unconsciousness is ordinary unconsciousness amplified by threat, the same ego-defending, now avoiding mechanisms running at maximum intensity. One of the most practically useful observations in this chapter is about what Tolle calls problems. He makes a careful distinction between a situation, which is a set of objective circumstances, and a problem, which is a situation that the mind has judged intolerable and demanded should be different than it is. Situations exist. Problems are created by the mind's resistance to situations. And resistance, he argues, does not change the situation. It only adds suffering to it. The situation remains exactly as it is. The resistance adds a layer of psychological pain on top of the objective facts. He offers a formulation that has stayed with many readers. You can always cope with the present moment. You cannot cope with the future because the future is not here. But this present moment, however difficult, is survivable. It always has been, for every moment you have ever experienced. The mind's catastrophizing, its projection of present difficulty into an imagined terrible future, creates the experience of being overwhelmed not by the actual present, but by the mind's simulation of what might come. And that simulation, however vivid, is not real. Only this is real. Part 6. The State of Presence. What it actually feels like. Chapter 5 is the book's most important and most difficult chapter to summarize, because what Tolle is describing in it is not a concept but an experience, and the experience, by its nature, is not accessible through language. He is describing what it feels like to be genuinely, fully present. And he can only point toward it the way all the spiritual traditions he is drawing on have only been able to point toward it, because the thing itself is prior to language and cannot be captured in it. Presence, as Tolle describes it, is not a state you manufacture. It is what is already here when the compulsive mental activity of the ego mind is temporarily suspended. It is the awareness that has always been the background of your experience, the space in which thoughts arise and pass, the consciousness in which emotions occur and dissolve, the witnessing quality that has been present throughout your entire life without ever changing, while everything it witnessed changed continuously. He makes a comparison that many readers have found useful. The mind is like the surface of the ocean. When the wind blows, when stimulation comes, when emotional activation occurs, the surface becomes choppy, turbulent, full of waves. But the depth of the ocean is not disturbed by the surface turbulence. Presence is the depth. The thoughts and emotions are the waves. And the person who is identified with their mind is like someone who believes they are the waves, who goes up and down with every fluctuation, who mistakes the surface movement for the entire reality of the ocean. The person who has touched presence, who has experienced what Tolle is pointing toward, has found the depth. And from the depth, the waves are still visible, still real, still occasionally dramatic, but they are no longer all there is. He is careful to say that this state, genuine presence, the direct experience of consciousness prior to thought, is not a state of stupor or vacancy. It is not the absence of intelligence. It is, he argues, the presence of a different and deeper kind of intelligence than the analytical mind provides, an intelligence that is immediate, responsive, creative, and not limited by the mental categories and historical conditioning through which ordinary thought operates. The greatest creative insights, the most powerful acts of compassion, the deepest forms of love, these, Tolle argues, arise not from the thinking mind but from the space of presence that the thinking mind normally occludes. Part 7. The Inner Body. Presence through physical awareness. One of the most practically accessible teachings in the book is the chapter on what Tolle calls the inner body, and it is worth dwelling on, because it offers something that the more abstract parts of the book can lack. A concrete, immediate practice that doesn't require any particular belief or metaphysical commitment. The inner body, as Tolle describes it, is the felt sense of aliveness in the body, the tingling, pulsing, energy-like quality that you can feel in your hands if you close your eyes and direct your attention into them. Not the physical body as seen from the outside, as an object to be analyzed or improved or displayed. The body as experienced from the inside, as a field of living sensation that is always here, always in the present moment, always available as an anchor to the now. The practice is simple. At any moment, in any situation, you can direct a portion of your attention to the felt sense of aliveness in your body. Not thinking about your body. Feeling it. The difference is immediate and significant. Thinking about your body involves the mind. It produces judgments, comparisons, memories, projections. Feeling the body directly involves presence. It is immediate, sensory, grounded in the only moment that exists. Tolle argues that this practice is one of the most reliable portals into the present moment available to ordinary human beings in ordinary circumstances. Because the body is always in the present moment. The body cannot be in the past. It cannot be in the future. It is always, irreducibly, here. And by directing attention into the physical experience of being alive, into the heartbeat, the breath, the aliveness in the hands and feet and the chest, you bring yourself into alignment with the one dimension of your existence that is always and only now. He also makes a connection that has proven relevant to somatic therapy and trauma-informed psychology. The body holds what the mind has been unable to process. Emotional material that was too intense to be fully experienced consciously gets stored in the body as tension, as contraction, as patterns of holding that become chronic and eventually invisible to the person carrying them. The practice of inner body awareness, bringing conscious presence to what lives in the body, is a way of accessing and potentially releasing this stored material without the mind's tendency to immediately construct a story around it. Part 8. Portals into the unmanifested, silence, space. And Death Chapter 7 is the most mystical section of the book and the one that will either resonate most deeply or produce the most resistance, depending on your orientation. Tolle moves from the immediately practical into territory that is genuinely metaphysical, into what he calls the unmanifested, which is his term for the formless dimension of reality that underlies and generates all manifest form. He introduces several specific portals, ways of accessing, even briefly, this deeper dimension. The first is silence. Not the absence of sound, which is relatively rare, and not what Tolle means. The silence he is pointing toward is what he calls the inner silence, the awareness itself, the consciousness that is present even in the midst of noise. That is not itself sound or thought or sensation, but the space in which all of these arise. You can access this inner silence in any moment by shifting attention from the content of your experience to the awareness of the content, from the thought to the consciousness thinking it, from the sound to the consciousness hearing it. This shift is subtle but real and immediately available. The second portal is space. Tolle observes that our attention is almost entirely drawn to objects, to the things that appear in our experience, to the content of consciousness. We rarely attend to the space in which objects appear. But space is not nothing. The space between thoughts is not an absence. The silence around sound is not mere emptiness. And the consciousness that is aware of both the things and the space between the things is itself a form of the unmanifested, the formless dimension that makes all form possible. The third portal is, perhaps, the most unexpected and the most philosophically important: death. Not death in the frightening, future tense sense that the ego contemplates. Death as the most immediate and certain fact about the form you currently inhabit. Tolle argues, drawing on traditions from Buddhism to Christianity, that the genuine contemplation of your own mortality, held not as an abstract concept but as a direct recognition that this body will dissolve, that this particular configuration of consciousness and form will not always be here, is one of the most powerful dissolvents of the ego's grip. Because the ego is terrified of death. Death is the ultimate threat to its existence. And when you genuinely look at the fact of your own impermanence without flinching, when you allow the recognition to be real rather than merely conceptual, something in the grip of the ego identity releases. What remains, Tolle suggests, is the awareness that was always there underneath, the consciousness that is not the form and therefore not subject to the dissolution of the form. Part 9. Enlightened Relationships and Beyond Happiness. The final chapters of the book apply the framework to the domains of relationship and emotional life, and here Tolle offers some of his most practically specific and most challenging teachings. On relationships, his central observation is one that resonates immediately and is equally immediately difficult to implement. Most human relationships are not connections between two present people. They are connections between two egos, two mind-constructed identities that are each using the other, at least in part, as a mirror, a validation, a threat to be managed, or a source of the sense of completeness that the ego chronically lacks. What Tolle calls love-hate relationships, the dynamic in which intimacy and hostility alternate in a cycle that neither person fully understands, is the ego's characteristic pattern in close relationship. The closeness activates the ego's fear of losing itself. The withdrawal is the ego's protective response. The hostility is the ego defending its territory. None of this is conscious. All of it is automatic, driven by the pain body and the ego's fundamental insecurity. The alternative, what Tolle calls an enlightened relationship, is not a relationship without difficulty or conflict. It is a relationship in which both people are sufficiently present, sufficiently awake to their own ego patterns, that they can recognize the ego's game when it is running and choose not to play along. The difference between an ordinary relationship and an enlightened one, Tolle suggests, is not the quality of the two people's feelings for each other. It is the degree to which they can bring genuine presence to the relationship rather than the ego's reactive patterns. And the degree of presence available to any person in relationship is limited, essentially, by the degree of presence they have cultivated in themselves. In Chapter 9, Tolle makes a distinction that is both philosophically interesting and genuinely important for how you understand what you're pursuing when you pursue happiness. He distinguishes between happiness, which is a positive emotional state, pleasant and desirable, but fundamentally dependent on conditions, arising when circumstances are favorable and departing when they are not, and peace, which he describes as something deeper, more stable, less contingent. Peace is not an emotional state. It is a quality of presence. It is what is there when neither happiness nor unhappiness is running, when you are simply, fully present. His argument is that most people spend their lives alternating between happiness and unhappiness, between moments when conditions align with preferences and moments when they don't, without ever discovering the dimension of their experience that is prior to both. And that dimension, peace, is not something you achieve. It is what is revealed when you stop adding the suffering of psychological time, the resistance, the rumination, the future dread, to your present experience. Part 10. The meaning of surrender. The final teaching, the final chapter of the book addresses what Tolle calls surrender, and again. This word requires careful unpacking because it is almost entirely unlike what it sounds like and what most people's instinct will tell them it means. Surrender, in Tolle's usage, does not mean passivity. It does not mean giving up. It does not mean accepting injustice or abandoning effort. It means something very precise, accepting the inner state of the present moment as it is, without the additional suffering of resistance. Not accepting the external situation as permanent or unchangeable. Accepting what is happening right now inside you as what is happening right now, not what should be happening, not what you wish were happening, not what the ego demands should be different, but what actually is. He offers a formulation that has crystallized for many readers the entire book's teaching. Whatever the present moment contains, accept it as if you had chosen it. Not as a performance. As a genuine orientation, a willingness to be with what is, because what is what is, regardless of whether you are willing to be with it or not. The difference is not in the external circumstances. The difference is in whether you are adding the suffering of resistance to the facts of the situation, or whether you are bringing the clarity and energy of presence to engaging with those facts as they actually are. He ends with what is, in many ways, the simplest and most radical sentence in the book. Realize deeply that the present moment is all you ever have. Not as a philosophical position. Not as a belief. As a living recognition, held in the body, felt in the breath, present in the awareness that is reading these words right now. The present moment is all you ever have. And in that all, in the full, complete, undefended inhabitation of this irreducible instant, is everything that has ever been described as peace, freedom, love, or God. The Critique, where the power of now overreaches, manipulates, and earns honest scrutiny. Now let's be completely honest. Because this book generates more intense critical response than almost anything else in this genre, from professional philosophers, from psychologists, from trauma specialists, from scientists, from religious scholars, and from ordinary people who found either that it changed their lives or that it made their lives worse. And the critics are not wrong. The problems are real, significant, and in some cases serious enough to constitute genuine risks for vulnerable readers. Let's start with the most structurally important critique, and the one most worth understanding first, because it frames everything else. Several serious critics have identified the power of now as what they call a self-sealing or unfalsifiable belief system. This means that the book is structured in a way that makes it impossible to criticize from within its own logic. If you find the book's ideas unconvincing, Tolle's framework has an answer ready. Your resistance to the ideas is the ego defending itself. Your skepticism is just the mind refusing to see past itself. Your rational objections are exactly what the ego would generate to protect its grip. The critique becomes evidence for the thing being critiqued. This is a classic feature of closed systems, religious, political, or psychological, that immunize themselves against falsification by incorporating resistance as further proof of the system's validity. The person who doubts the teaching is not engaged with on the merits of their doubt. They are diagnosed. Their doubt is a symptom. And the symptom, of course, can only be treated by accepting the teaching. This is not philosophy. This is a rhetorical trap. And it is woven into the fabric of the book's structure, present in the dialogue format, in the way Tolle handles the seeker's objections, and in the explicit claim that rational analysis is not the appropriate tool for engaging with these ideas. To be clear, the experiences Tolle is describing, the direct experience of present moment awareness, the recognition of the gap between thought and the awareness of thought, the quality of presence that contemplative traditions across cultures have described and that neuroscience is now beginning to study. These are real. They are not inventions of a fraudulent teacher. They are genuine aspects of human consciousness that have been documented across millennia and that modern research on meditation and mindfulness is beginning to understand in scientific terms. The insight is real, but Tolle presents it in a framework that actively discourages the critical engagement that real insight can withstand and fraudulent systems cannot. And that discouragement is dangerous. Second, the book's treatment of negative emotions is clinically problematic in ways that matter for people with genuine mental health conditions. Tolle consistently characterizes negative emotions, anxiety, anger, grief, fear, as products of ego identification and unconsciousness. He argues that the aware, present person will experience greatly reduced suffering because suffering is primarily generated by the mind's resistance to what is. Awareness and presence, he implies, dissolve emotional pain in the way that light dissolves darkness. This is not what happens in clinical depression. It is not what happens in post-traumatic stress. It is not what happens in obsessive-compulsive disorder, in bipolar disorder, in psychosis. In the vast range of mental health conditions that are not primarily produced by compulsive thinking and that are not primarily addressable by the cultivation of present-moment awareness. The neurobiological reality of these conditions, the measurable alterations in brain chemistry and structure, the genuine dysregulation of the nervous system, does not yield primarily to spiritual practice. It often requires targeted pharmacological and psychological intervention that the book's framework not only doesn't address, but actively distracts from. There are documented cases of people with serious mental health conditions who encountered the power of now during a vulnerable period and who either used it to avoid seeking clinical help they genuinely needed, or who found that its emphasis on dissolving the ego and releasing identification with the mind destabilized an already fragile sense of self in ways that made their condition worse rather than better. The experience of derealization, of the self feeling unreal, of the boundary between self and world becoming unclear, which Tolle describes in his own spiritual breakthrough as liberation, can also be a symptom of serious psychiatric disturbance. For someone already experiencing dissociative symptoms, a book that enthusiastically encourages the dissolution of ordinary ego identification is not harmless. Tolle acknowledges, briefly, that some people may need professional help. The acknowledgement is so cursory, and the book's overall confident tone so pervasive that many readers in genuine need will not register it as applying to them. Third, the book's philosophical claims about the nature of consciousness, time, and being are presented with a certainty that significantly exceeds what any current philosophical or scientific framework can support. Tolle makes metaphysical claims about the ultimate nature of consciousness, about the existence of a formless dimension of reality that underlies all manifest form, about the relationship between individual awareness and universal being that are genuinely interesting philosophical positions, but that are far from established. They draw from specific traditions within Advaita Vedanta, Zen Buddhism, Christian mysticism, and various other sources, but they are not the agreed-upon conclusions of these traditions in their full complexity. They are one interpretation, presented as revelation. The most serious philosophical problem is Tolle's claim that the present moment is the only reality. This is, at minimum, highly contestable. The past, while not directly accessible, is causally real. It is the reason you are who you are. And dismissing it as merely a mental construction occurring in the present significantly undervalues the genuine importance of memory, learning, historical understanding, and the experience of being a being with a continuous identity across time. The future, similarly, is not merely a mental construction. It is the real domain in which the consequences of present choices will occur. And a philosophy that radically devalues future orientation creates practical difficulties for any person who needs to plan, save, build, or navigate a complex social world. Tolle makes the important and correct point that excessive psychological identification with the past or anxious dwelling in an imagined future is a source of suffering. This is true and important. But he moves from this correct observation to a much stronger claim that the past and future are not real, that only the present moment exists, that is philosophically much harder to defend, and that, applied too rigidly, produces a form of presentism that is neither psychologically healthy nor practically viable. Fourth, the book's treatment of relationships is philosophically idealistic in ways that can produce real harm if applied naively. Tolle's description of the ego's role in intimate relationships, while often accurate as description, slides toward a prescription that can inadvertently support the staying in genuinely harmful situations in the name of not being controlled by the ego's resistance. If your discomfort in a relationship is always potentially the ego defending itself, if your instinct to leave a damaging situation is always potentially the pain body generating reactivity, you have lost the ability to distinguish between the ego's irrational resistance to intimacy and the healthy, appropriate recognition that a relationship is genuinely harmful. The boundary between these two things, the ego's fearful avoidance and genuine discernment, requires exactly the kind of careful, historically informed thinking that Tolle's framework tends to deprioritize. Fifth, there is a genuine question about the origin and interpretation of Tolle's formative experience. He describes a dramatic, overnight transformation from severe depression and suicidal ideation to permanent, blissful equanimity. Whatever happened to him, and something clearly did, given the quality and consistency of his subsequent teaching, the event he describes resembles, to psychologists familiar with the literature, a dissociative episode following extreme psychological crisis. This does not mean the experience was invalid or that its effects were not real. But it does mean that presenting it as a model for how ordinary people should relate to their minds, essentially, as a template for what healthy human consciousness looks like, deserves more careful framing than the book provides. The person who had a dramatic, involuntary transformation during a psychological crisis has had a very specific experience. The person who is going to work Monday morning with a difficult manager and a sick parent and a mortgage payment due is in a very different situation. The gap between these is not addressed with adequate seriousness. Sixth, Tolle's discussion of gender, which appears in several places in the book, has aged poorly and was controversial even when the book was published. He claims that women are closer to enlightenment than men because they are less trapped in the mind. This is both empirically unfounded and structurally condescending. It is a form of the spiritual but not rational gendering that has been used to both compliment and diminish women across the history of spiritual thought. It appears in the book with no apparent awareness of how it might land, and it is one of several moments where the confidence of Tolle's voice obscures the thinness of his actual evidence. And finally, the critique that runs through every book in this series, and that here has particular weight. Reading The Power of Now is not the same as being present. In fact, it may be, for some readers, a particularly effective way of not being present, of spending time in the comfortable, intellectually engaging activity of reading about presence as a substitute for the much more difficult and much less comfortable practice of actually sitting with your own experience, without a book, without a teacher, without the reassurance of someone telling you that you are on the right track. Tolle knows this.
He says so.
He says repeatedly that the words are only a finger pointing at the moon, and that no one was ever liberated by reading. But the commercial ecosystem around Tolle, the books, the CDs, the courses, the appearances, the Oprah specials, the online community, creates the conditions in which engaging with his teaching becomes a substitute for the silence he is actually prescribing. If you want to know whether the book is pointing towards something real, the test is not whether reading it feels meaningful. The test is what happens when you close it. Final thoughts. Let's end with what is most true, and with the humility that this particular book, more than most, demands. Eckhart Tolle sat on a park bench for 2 years after his experience. This is not a detail.
It is the center of the whole thing.
Because the experience he had, whatever it was, however we categorize it, however much the critics can identify with it as dissociation or depersonalization or breakthrough or breakdown, led him to a period of complete stillness. Not productivity. Not platform building. Not writing the book. Stillness. The park bench. The birds. The morning light. The absolute sufficiency of the present moment without anything added to it. That quality, the quality of not needing the moment to be other than it is, the quality of presence that is complete in itself, the quality of awareness that rests in its own nature, without requiring external validation or future improvement or past explanation, is genuinely real. The contemplative traditions of the world did not all independently invent the same experience. They are pointing with different language and different frameworks and different cultural containers at something that is actually there. Tolle is also pointing at it. The pointing is real. The system built around the pointing, the self-sealing framework, the ego diagnosis of every objection, the sweeping metaphysical claims, the inadequate attention to clinical reality, the commercial apparatus, the gendered claims, the implicit promise that this book can do what only years of sustained practice might gradually reveal. This is worth seeing clearly. The invitation is genuine and ancient and worth taking seriously. You are not your thoughts. The present moment is the only place where your life actually occurs. The awareness that notices experience is not the same as the experience it notices. These are real. They have been said before, and better, in the Zen tradition, in the Advaita tradition, in the writings of the Christian mystics. They are worth encountering. They are worth sitting with. Close the book. Sit quietly for 5 minutes. Feel the weight of your body in the seat. Listen to the sounds in the room. Notice that there is something simple and immediate, and without commentary, that is aware of all of this. Not a thing. Not a person. Awareness itself. Here.
Now.
That is what Tolle is pointing at. Everything else is the finger.